Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we welcome you once again, our listeners, our viewers on the various platforms of Salam Media this evening. It is Wednesday night with myself, Inayat Wadi, and wonderful to be back with you on this platform. And once again, we are taking a look at issues that impact on us as a Muslim Ummah this evening. And being in the month of Rajab now, the month of Rajab is extremely relevant for us as a Muslim Ummah because when we are looking at the Muslim world, and at this point in time, we all speak of a leadership vacuum. We talk about an Ummah that is leaderless. And this is where the month of Rajab is so relevant in terms of the destruction of the Uthmani Khilafah that had taken place. Now, for centuries, the Muslim world has always had great leaders from the beginning of Islam, from the time of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the Khulafai Rashideen. And when we look at it through the ages and looking through the Umayyad, the Abbasid dynasties, right until the last Caliph Sultan Abdul Hamid. And this is when the end of the Uthmani Khilafah had taken place. And when one looks at what has happened since then, looking at the state of the Muslim Ummah and the degeneration. Now, this can be termed as a catastrophe, as a disaster for the Muslim Ummah in more ways than one. And being in the month of Rajab, I thought it is relevant that we should be talking about the destruction of the Khilafah and what it actually means for the Muslim world. And also the second reason being, we have a guest in South Africa from Hizb ut-Tahrir, a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir. We've got Brother Mazhar Khan, who is in South Africa. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we are going to unpack what the fall of the Khilafah has meant for the Muslim Ummah. And right now, going across to be joined by my guest, Mazhar Khan, who is here from the United Kingdom and in South Africa as we speak. Mazhar, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As always, welcome, Jazakallah khairan, and wonderful that you are in South Africa.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And yes, it's always a pleasure to come onto your platform, and it's also a pleasure to be in your country. And it's been a long time since we've known one another, but we are going to meet in person soon. So I'm looking forward to that too.
Well, certainly, I am looking forward to meeting you this Friday. And up front, I'd just like to remind our listeners, our viewers, that Mazhar will be in Benoni on Friday, performing the khutbah at Miftah al-Khair. And also, we've got a program on Friday evening out in Actonville in Benoni. So for those of you who are close to the area, this is something that you need to take off. But Mazhar, let's talk about this month of Rajab. Extremely relevant, and the point I had made at this point in time is looking at the leadership vacuum and the catastrophe, the disaster that had actually befallen this Muslim Ummah in this month of Rajab, close on to 100 years ago.
Yeah, you know what, Rajab is a very, very significant month. As you quite rightly bring to our attention, the demise and the end of the Khilafah, which began with Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu anh and continued until 1924, and it ended in the month of Rajab. But month of Rajab also is connected. I think these things are all connected. The month of Rajab is connected with Isra and Mi'raj, when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to the blessed land and ascended to the sky, and we know about the story about that. But also, it's such a spiritual night and such a significant night that on this night, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed his slave Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi to liberate Al-Aqsa on this very night, in this very month of Rajab. Connecting these two events to show some kind of a significance of how important this thing was. And I would say that the Khilafah is also connected to this, because it's with the Khilafah Salah ad-Din liberated Al-Aqsa, and this month has shown us that the fall of the Khilafah is so significant, has caused so much problems in the world, not just for Muslims, which I'll inshallah come on to in a minute, but also for the non-Muslims. So it is with the coming of the Khilafah again, inshallah, that again we will find a new Salahuddin to bring about the liberation of Masjid al-Aqsa and bring back the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for people to feel and experience. So this month of Rajab is very significant and important, and I think it's important that we as Muslims know our history and commemorate these events, because it's part and parcel of our history, which shapes our view of events in the world, in the past, and also going forward in the future, inshallah.
Yes, and also, Mazhar, one cannot forget or lose sight of the fact that for 13 centuries, the Muslim Ummah lived under this noble rule of a leader of a khilaf under Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the Khulafai Rashidin. And over the years, I spoke of the various dynasties in my introduction. And one must not lose sight of that in terms of what Muslims had actually enjoyed under a Khalif.
No, absolutely, because as you rightly mentioned, there was a number of dynasties that did exist. But under these dynasties, we talk about the great, what we call Baytul Hikmah in Baghdad, which was the repository of so many books from so many different civilizations, all collated into one place for the academics, for the ulama, to research, to read, to learn, to add to the knowledge base and allow this knowledge to benefit humanity. It wasn't copyrighted. It wasn't confined just to the Muslims. Other communities and other nations also benefited from this knowledge. Europeans came and learned Arabic, read these books, and also benefited from this knowledge. It was, you could say, we had Google before Google even came. We had Google in Baytul Hikmah, where we created repository of the world's knowledge of that time and made it available to all of the world. But it's well documented how the Muslims benefited under the Khilafah. But I think one thing sometimes maybe which is overlooked, and is very significant today with what's going on in the world, is that Islam didn't just come for the Muslims. And this is very important for us to understand. The Khilafah didn't just come for the Muslims. The Khilafah is the manifestation of Islam to manifest the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that it can allow the Muslims to enact the mercy of Allah for all of the alameen, not just for Muslims. The Prophet was rahmatul lil alameen, for all of the world, for all of the people, which includes Muslims and non-Muslims, which includes the animals, which includes the environment, which includes everything. And the Muslims brought a balance. So when we look at the problem of Hindutva today, you got 80% Hindus in India and maybe 10 to 15% Muslims in India, but they are considered such a problems that they cannot be accommodated by the Hindus or the Hindutva ideology, and they are saying that these Muslims either must embrace our culture or they must accept to live as almost like slaves in our country. And same we see in Palestine, where the Muslims of Palestine are reduced as stateless people in their own land. Islam, on the other hand, when we ruled India under the shade of the rule of Islam, the Hindus, who were a majority, lived for almost 1,000 years under the Muslim rule because we accommodated them. Islam is a civilization which has this concept of Ahl Dhimma, which no other civilization has. And what I mean by that is, we have this concept of Ahl Dhimma, where people who don't believe in Islam, we allow them full citizenship of the Islamic land. And not only that, they pay us the jizya. And for paying the jizya, we guarantee them protection. Meaning that the Muslims will fight and die for your protection of your life and your property. And there's many examples of that in Islamic history. And we have maybe more taxes to pay. We pay zakat, we pay ushr, and many other taxes related to our iman, which the non-Muslims are not expected to pay. We appointed judges over them to deal with their private affairs. So Christians who had marital disputes or personal disputes about their religion, they had their judges to judge over them, right? We didn't impose our belief on their personal matters. Just right now in the UK, they are reviewing the prevent strategy, and they are saying it's failing because this policy was enacted in order to put pressure on the Muslims to re-engineer Muslims and to arrest any Muslims who spoke out of line. But because of this policy, they started to arrest too many non-Muslims, like the right-wing extremists and the incel activists. So now they are reevaluating this policy. How can we reshape it so we can focus back on the Muslims and not on everybody else? Because they can't accommodate us and our values. We can accommodate them. They can't accommodate us. So for hundreds of years in India, in Spain, in other parts of the world, even in the early days in Asham, where the Christians and the Jews lived, the Muslims were a minority, but we fulfilled their rights and we accommodated them. In the absence of the Khilafah, the Muslims are now foreigners in their own lands in India, or foreigners in Palestine, and we as migrants in the West are treated like second-class citizens, where our citizenship is not even as equal to the or the natives of that land. And this is a consequence of the absence of the Khilafah, because the Khilafah came in those days when it existed as a caretaker, because the Khalifa is a vice regent of Allah, the one who takes care of people's affairs. So we looked after people and gave them their rights. But in the absence of that, we have chaos with all these human rights issues. We have chaos with immigration and migration and racism. But on top of all of that, the capitalism has destroyed the economies, where we've got more billionaires than we ever had, and we've got more hungry people than we've ever had. We've got capitalism destroyed the environment and the ecology, where, which is causing, people claim now, climate change because of the number of trees that have been chopped away, and they've affected the oceans and the fishes in the sea, all because of capitalism. All because why? We have vacated the seat of taking care of people, taking care of the planet, and taking care of the affairs of all that lives on this earth. And in the absence of the Islamic civilization, which you spoke about, these are all the problems. So it's not just that we Muslims are suffering with the absence of Islam. That Rahmatul lil Alameen, which the Prophet was, is absent for the non-Muslims and for the animals and for the environment. So we are all suffering because of the absence. Even they don't realize it, that a lot of their problems is because Islam has now vacated that seat of being the caretaker and the leader of the world.
Well, clearly, what you are saying, and then we are also reminded of the hadith of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, where Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam reminds us about the Imam being a shield, where we actually fight behind the Imam. We are protected by the Imam. And I read quite an interesting quote, going back into the 19th century with regard to the British Prime Minister, Disraeli, where he held a book of he held the Quran in British Parliament, Mazhar, and where he said that Muslims could never be defeated until it was actually taken away from them. But, it is not about the Quran not being with us. I mean, we read the Quran in our masajids, we read it at home. But what he had actually meant that ruling by Islam, and, this is exactly where the problem is, because they don't want us to be ruled by Islam, and at the same time looking at all the ideologies that they have basically imposed upon us. So that code is actually very, very relevant, that despite being well over 1.6 billion strong, reading the Quran on a daily basis, and the thousands and thousands of huffaz that we've got, the millions of huffaz right across the entire world. And we see that this living by Islam is the problem, and it is not the Quran itself.
No, absolutely. And we find that the enemies of Islam, or the opponents of Islam, actually understand the significance of the Quran and Islam more than many Muslims may appreciate. So that is why you will find the policies targeting Muslims are disproportionately focused on the Muslims, but not on the other religious people. So when they talk about Islamic schools and not following the LGBTQ agenda, and they're being very harsh on the Muslims, the Jewish schools don't follow it, but they are lenient with them. And many Christian schools may not follow it, they are lenient with them. And many elite private schools may not teach this stuff, but they are lenient with them. But they single out the Muslims because all the other religions inherently are secular. They focus on the individual's morals and the individual's rituals. Whereas Islam is not just that. Islam is a furqan. Sorry, the Quran is a furqan. And they don't want the Quran to be the furqan, the criteria for deciding what is right and wrong for the Muslims. So, like today and yesterday, we had a very very engaging presentation at two Islamic schools in Eurasia and also Lothian over the last couple of days. And this was one of the points I made, that the West are hell-bent on making the Muslims accept that the highest furqan in the land is liberal secular values and not the Quran. So they say that the rights of the Muslim is equal to the rights of the homosexuals. So you have a right to abide by Islam is equal to the rights of the homosexuals. Why? Because liberal secular values have determined that you are equal. But we say no. We say what are legitimate rights cannot be equated what are illegitimate rights, because the Quran has legitimized the rights of human beings but made certain things like fahisha and LGBTQ plus values invalid. So we don't equate them, and they don't like this. And this is a problem some ulama and some speakers in America have fallen into by saying that we support LGBT rights because they support our rights. No, we don't fight for our rights under liberal secular values. We fight for our rights because Allah mandated that in the Quran and through the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is a struggle we have, where the West wants the Muslims to abandon Islam as a deen, as using the Quran and the Sunnah as a furqan in life's affairs, and rather we become like the Anglican Christians, where we just confine the religion to our home and to our churches. And that's something we can never do, and hence there is this continual struggle. And alhamdulillah, because of the sincerity of many of the Muslims, the normal common Muslims and many ulama, the sincerity and courage of them is allowing this call to remain. And I give an example, for example, slightly off topic, in the UK, that it's the common people that are holding on to what is right. There was an incident in a school in Birmingham not too long ago. I think you might have covered it on your program as well, where some children corrected a Muslim gay person who came to the school to tell them that being gay and Muslim is okay. And the children said, look, you can say what you want, but don't say that Islam says that, because Islam doesn't say that. And another child said, if you want to be gay, that's fine, but don't come and tell us that our religion says it's okay, because it's not okay. And it caused such a hoo-ha that the parliament had to address the issue. An incident took place in a small school in a small town outside Birmingham. The parliament of Great Britain had to address this issue. Where were the Muslim MPs? Where were the Muslim councillors? Where were the Muslim, people of responsibility? Even many of the masajids and the public ulama remained quiet. It was the parents and the children that spoke up. And you know what? Because of their courage and because of their honesty in speaking up, there are many non-Muslims who are now having the courage to also speak up and say, you know what? We too don't want our children to be taught these values. So it's given the confidence to the Christians, it's given confidence to the Jews and confidence to other communities to say, you know what? We don't agree with this. If you want to do it, you do it, but don't teach our kids this stuff. So the point you make about Huffaz, about Quran, is a very important point, because the Quran is not just there to be read. It's meant to be the Furqan, a criteria, but it needs that Islamic society and civilization for it to be realized. And unfortunately, in the absence of that, we are in the situation that we are in today.
Yes, Mazhar, there are many examples. You speak about Islamic society and you speak about Islamic civilization. And there are many, many examples that one can actually take from rulers of the past, even from Sultan Abdul Hamid, the last Khalif, Uthmani Khalif himself, in terms of how he dealt with the many issues, with the challenges that he had faced. I mean, he dealt with the Americans, he dealt with the British, he dealt with the French, the Russians were there, the Germans were there. All of them were around at that point in time. But one thing he never did was he never compromised Islam. He never compromised his deen. And there are many, many examples that we can take, and the leadership, the Muslim or the so-called Muslim leadership today, can take from the life of Sultan Abdul Hamid in terms of how he dealt with challenges. And an example that comes to mind was, we see so much in terms of the dishonor, that the West have shown to Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the cartoons, the Charlie Hebdos, and one sees it over and over again. And I think during his time there was a play or something that the French had arranged, and he took a very, very strong stance. And there have been many other cases where Muslims in India were being persecuted, and he sent an entire army. We know what has happened in the Balkans. Now, over the years, we've seen so much happen, whether we're talking about Bosnia, we talk about Palestine, you've just spoken about India as well, and also all the other challenges that we as a Muslim Muslim Ummah are faced with today, and the importance on the part of the Muslim leadership to deal with it. And I'm sure many, many examples just in the life of Sultan Abdul Hamid alone that we can take.
No, absolutely. Sultan Abdul Hamid, when you look into his life, we see many examples. And the one you talk about when the French tried to insult Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and the British tried to insult him, he stood up and he defended the honor of the Prophet. Before they even got to doing it, he was proactive. Not like today, they abuse the Prophet and then the leaders give some lip service because of the pressure from the Muslims. He was proactive. He didn't wait for anybody to complain to him. When he found out from his sources this was happening, he was proactive. But the important thing to remember also is that when Sultan Abdul Hamid took this stance against the British Empire, when they wanted to stage the play at the Lyceum Theatre in London, it's interesting to note, I forget the reference, but there was a book written by a historian who said that after this event, no European country ever insulted the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam again in any kind of a meaningful way until Salman Rushdie in 1988. So for almost 80 years, nobody dared criticize or insult the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam of what Sultan Abdul Hamid did. And now when the Salman Rushdie did this, they realized, yes, the Muslims shouted, but the rulers did nothing. Then they did it again and again. And now it's like almost the daily occurrence. Just recently in Sweden, we saw what happened. So the existence of a sultan for the Muslims not only just protects the Muslims, but also protects the honor of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And it makes the enemies of Islam think twice before they act. And Sultan Abdul Hamid, his presence made life easy for the Muslims in domains outside of his control. So for example, Sultan Abdul Hamid was a globalist visionary. He reached out to different parts of the world. He reached out to Japan to the extent that Japan was considering as a state to embrace Islam. The Japanese emperor was seriously considering whether Islam should become the main religion of their land. And this was because of the efforts of Sultan Abdul Hamid. Sultan Abdul Hamid appointed Abdullah Quilliam in Britain as the Sheikhul Islam of Britain. And he appointed Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan, or Maulana Mahmud al-Hassan became the de facto Sheikhul Islam of India. And Sultan Abdul Hamid had relations with these people, so he was connected around the world knowing what's happening. Now, because of Abdullah Quilliam in Britain, the British government now had to tread carefully in the way they dealt with the Muslims in Britain, because if they stepped out of line, Abdullah Quilliam would tell Sultan Abdul Hamid and they would have to deal with an international issue. So we find that Muslims were given respect in Britain at that time. So for example, whenever a dignitary came from another country to visit Britain, not only the official representative of Queen Victoria would go and receive them at the port, whether it was in Liverpool or London, Abdullah Quilliam would also accompany them, who would also accompany them in their entourage to receive any Muslim guest that came to that country. So because Abdullah Quilliam had a status and he was under the protection of Sultan Abdul Hamid, that brought about respect and dignity for Muslims who were living in a different land. And Muslims around the world could live with dignity, knowing full well that they had somebody who would speak up on their behalf. So the enemies of Islam had to think twice before doing something. Now, okay, there might have been problems here and there, but at least it brought some level of dignity to the Muslim. Where today it's totally absent. Today it is totally absent. Muslims can be abused and killed or whatever, and nobody bats an eyelid. And that is one of the effects of the absence of a sultan of the Muslims. Even though you may not be living in his domain, his presence has a beneficial effect on those Muslims who also live outside of his domain, like we saw in Britain at the time of Sultan Abdul Hamid. And you mentioned these other rulers in Europe, Germany, France, and all this. They might have been opponents of Sultan Abdul Hamid, but they recognized what a statesman he was, and what a great man he was. It's reported in the biography of Abdullah Quilliam that when he wrote some books about Islam, he sent them to Queen Victoria, and she requested another 7 copies of the book or 8 copies of the book to give to her children, right? Because of his stature in Britain, because of Sultan Abdul Hamid. And if you ever go to Istanbul and visit the grave of Sultan Abdul Hamid, you will find that in there is a chandelier hanging in his mausoleum that was a gift from Queen Victoria. And there's also a clock in that mausoleum that was given by Napoleon. So his opponents also, they might have disagreed with him, but they recognized him as a great man, and they gave gifts to him.
Yes, but also, apart from the challenges we face, looking at where we are at this point in time, from the West, from the United States of America, from Europe, from right across the entire world, where Muslims are being challenged in more ways than one. Apart from all the ideological problems, the persecution, the death, the destruction, we've seen Muslims make up the highest number of refugees in the world, internally, externally displaced, all the occupations that have taken place. But we also need to internalize, we need to look at ourselves internally in terms of how much we have contributed to our very own destruction. And this is where, I just want to focus a bit on the Muslim leadership today versus leaders like Sultan Abdul Hamid and many other great leaders of the past, Mazhar.
No, you bring up another very interesting point. And after Sultan Abdul Hamid was dismissed from office, and the treachery of the Arab tribes, this is what actually really led to the destruction of the Uthmani Khilafah. Because it didn't matter how weak we were, it was always very difficult for the enemies of Islam to fight and destroy the Muslim army. And that's throughout history. Whenever you look at the Muslims losing battles or losing big events, it was because of treachery. So when the Mongols took over Baghdad, it was because of treachery from within. When the British took over India, it's because of treachery from within. And we found the same thing happening here at the eve of the fall of the Khilafah, is when the British army attacked Gaza in 1917. They lost something like 10,000 men in a battle against the Ottoman army defending Palestine. It was such a severe hit on the British army that London dismissed the general of the British army, and they withdrew whatever troops were there. They withdrew them back into Egypt. They dismissed the general of the British army, and then they appointed Lord Allenby to become the general of the army of the British forces in Egypt to again attack Gaza. But he knew that it didn't matter how many men he had, he could not defeat the Ottoman army defending Gaza. So what he did, those British agents who were in the Middle East, like your Lawrence of Arabia and Captain Shakespeare, and there was another woman called Gertrude. These people were operatives in the Middle East who were getting the tribes to revolt. And these tribes who did revolt were a minority of the Arabs. The majority of the Arabs were with the Ottoman Sultan. So these tribes were enticed to attack the Ottomans from the north. So the British did a pincer movement against the Ottoman army from Egypt, and then the rebelling tribes of the Arabs from the north to attack the Ottomans. And that's how the Ottoman army was defeated in Palestine, and the British entered into Gaza. And then from Gaza, they marched to Jerusalem. And again, they got the Arab tribes to head the army entering into Jerusalem. And they went into Jerusalem and occupied it. And then the French came, and then we know they went to Syria, and they went to the grave of Salah ad-Din, and the French general kicked it and said to Salah ad-Din that today the Crusades have ended. And that only happened because of the treachery of these Arab tribes that helped to bring about the downfall of the Khilafah. At the same time, that obviously was happening in Turkey as well. There were agents working there. And with the downfall of the Khilafah, these Arab tribes were rewarded. And so the Saudi tribe were given their own little state. And the Hashemites were given their state in Jordan and Iraq and Syria. And Palestine was created, and the British took a mandate over this, and then they gave it to the Zionist Jews. And we find that Lebanon was created, and it was given, under the French mandate. So the whole land was divided, and those puppets and those agents that helped the West to destroy the Khilafah, they were rewarded by giving thrones and kingships that virtually exist to this day, and that treachery exists to this day. And the Zionist occupation of Palestine exists because they came into being at the same time as these Arab states, and their fate is tied to one another. So they are looking after one another. So the only reason the Zionist occupation exists in Palestine is not because the Muslim Ummah is not able to remove it. We are able to remove it, but we have treacherous agent rulers that use our armies and our wealth and our manpower, not for the cause of Islam. And this is one of the biggest living effects of the fall of the Khilafah that we still feel today and we still suffer from. So Muslims in their own countries who want to speak up about the truth are imprisoned and treated like foreigners and treated like refugees. So the whole ummah has become orphaned. If you want to live and identify as a Muslim, as a global Muslim, as the ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you are viewed as an Islamist in the West, and in the Muslim world you are viewed as a threat, and you are imprisoned. So the whole ummah has become like an orphan without the sultan to protect her.
Yes, and also, when one looks at the Muslim world today, and there is no shortage of resources. In fact, when one looks at the wealth of the world, the Muslim world is not short of any wealth whatsoever. Yet, we've given up control of our resources. Oil is a classic example, and many other resources where we've actually given up control. And when one looks at the time of the Khilafah, it was the height of progress under Sultan Abdul Hamid, innovation. He was always a step ahead. He had foresight, he was proactive, and he anticipated a lot that the enemies of Islam wanted to actually do. And this is something that has impacted on us. And we have leaders that don't have that foresight, they're not innovative. What can we actually be proud of as a Muslim world or as a Muslim leadership in control of a Muslim ummah, in control of these resources as well, Mazhar?
Currently, there is no leader or leadership that we can be proud of. I mean, just look now at the devastating earthquake which has taken place in Turkey. Already the estimates are saying over 10,000 have died. And in weeks to come, we'll find that number climbing higher and higher. It's caused utter devastation in Turkey, Syria, and other parts. Maybe even northern Lebanon might have been affected by it. But Turkey and Syria for sure have been devastated. Now, just a month or two ago, we had a football World Cup in Qatar where 220 billion was spent without even the blink of an eye. Stadiums, multi-million pound stadiums were put up to be used for 2 weeks and then become redundant. They had infrastructure built for the World Cup. A fraction of that money could be used to help the ummah, but it wasn't. And right now, when there is a dire need for the Muslims in Turkey and Syria who have got no homes, who have got no possessions, whose families have been killed, they are destitute and homeless, and many are injured. It is a difficult situation for them. There is wealth, resources, manpower right now to help these people, but our rulers will not do that. And what will happen is people like you and me will put our hands in our pocket to make donations to the charities in order to give the charities to send money there to try and help these people. And what kind of assistance is that when we've got billions and billions in resources in order to help the Muslims? The rulers are not doing that, and we who have very limited resources, we are there to help. This problem can be solved quite easily, but the rulers and the governments will refuse to do that.
Well, I promise you, if this earthquake had to happen in the United States of America or in France or in Britain, there would have been a different reaction from the Muslim leadership.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I mean, Europe doesn't even need to have an earthquake or a volcano or any kind of a disaster. They just have to have the economy go down. How many times have the Arab billions been donated to the West to prop up their economies? We saw that in 2008. We're seeing it now. We're seeing that, just now, we saw when the World Cup was going on, that we found out that the Qatari rulers have got more property in Britain than the Queen herself has. They've got multi-millions pounds worth of property. The Qataris, the Kuwaitis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Saudis, they own so much, and they are propping up the economies in the West. When their banks have a problem, when in 2008 they had the financial crisis, we found that it was I think it was the Bahrainis that donated to Barclays Bank in order to liquidate them because they were collapsing. So they run to their aid. Barclays Bank in the West didn't have to go to any charities. All they had to do was one phone call to one Arab puppet ruler, problem solved. We can't do that. And if anybody has any doubts, these events should show you that these rulers are not there to look after you. They are there to service the West. So now look at Saudi Arabia trying to build this NEOM project with the line development. This is in order because the West is now moving away from gas and oil. They are modeling their economies to service the West again. They're not doing it to service the Muslims. They want to create tax-free industrial zones for the West to come and do business and to want to create playgrounds for nightclubs and discos and raves and concerts for the West. So you see that they are servicing the West, they are not servicing the Ummah, and they will give token gestures to Islam, and then some Muslims will get pleased with these words and empty gestures that they do towards the Muslims. Just like at the World Cup, they spent 220 billion, but they invited one or two celebrity da'is to come and do da'wah, and so mashallah, we're doing da'wah. So, to keep Muslims appeased. Why didn't we see it the other way around? Why didn't we see 220 billion pounds spent on some kind of a massive Islamic project and invite the non-Muslims to come and play football as a sideshow? Then we could have said, yeah, alhamdulillah, now you're doing something for Islam. So these rulers are not there for us. And from their onset, they were put in power by the West as a reward for the destruction of the Khilafah. And they have been eternally grateful to the West. And they continue to make their Qibla the White House and not the Black House. And we see that year after year, day after day, hour after hour. And we'll see it now with the earthquake. There'll be some token donations, but nothing compared to the 220 billion spent for a World Cup. Nothing compared to the 200 billion spent by the Saudis on the NEOM project phase 1. They might donate $1 million here and people think, mashallah, they donated so much. This is the treachery of these people.
Well, certainly is. I know, Mazhar, this is such a huge topic, and we are not going to be doing justice in a matter of about 45 to 50 minutes. I just want to focus a bit on the revival of the Muslim Ummah. And when we speak about revival, we speak about revival in more ways than one, whether we're looking at it at a spiritual level, on a social level, on a socio-economic level, and also in terms of a political level, because that seems to be one area that seems to be lacking in terms of political thought. With all that is happening around us, clearly it requires a fundamental change in terms of mindset, in terms of our thought process as well. We need to start looking at things differently on what is happening around us, but at the same time, we need that revival to happen, Mazhar.
No, absolutely, and the revival is not only needs to happen; it is happening, and indeed we will see the fruits of it very soon, inshallah, no doubt. When the Muslims, the Khilafah was destroyed and the British Empire receded and many migrants came to the West to work. My father himself came to Britain in 1958. And the hope of the West was that when these migrants come to the West, they will be wowed by our civilization and they will become like us. So they thought our way of life is so strong and dominant, and our values are so strong and dominant. Anybody who comes to our society will melt into a society and become like us. But we find that the second and third generation of these people that migrated to Britain in the 50s and 60s hold on to Islam, maybe more so than the older generations did. And they have not been wowed by the West, and they have not assimilated into the West. And Islam is more, Muslims are more visible in the Western countries today than they ever were. Even though in France they want to ban the hijab and do all sorts of things, Muslims are still standing up for Islam. And this they can't take. That their values have failed, their civilizations have failed to integrate us. Whereas a few people want to watch the World Cup, and even though it's not an Islamic society, the people are Muslims, the culture is Muslim culture, and the behavior of the Muslims is largely Muslim. And even that has a positive impact on so many Western people that went to Qatar to watch the World Cup. And we don't even have the resources they have, and yet we have power in our thoughts, power in our values, power in our behavior in order to connect with us, other people, to bring them to Islam. So the revival is happening in the sense that Muslims are identifying more and more with Islam today than they were maybe 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And that is evident not just in the Western cities, but even in the Muslim cities. You know, if you look at any pictures of Cairo or of Kabul or Karachi from the 1950s, and you won't know whether it's Paris or whether it's Kabul, Karachi, or Cairo, right? You look at pictures today and you know these are Muslim cities because you see so many signs of outward expression of Islam. So a revival we find on a social level, at the society level, but political revival can only occur when there is a revival in the thought. And we have seen a change in that, because before there used to be a call in the Muslim world for Islamic socialism and Islamic democracy. You know, I personally don't really hear those calls anymore. Maybe some, in small corners here and there. But there used to be movements calling for Islamic democracy and Islamic, republics and this and that. That has all died. Now it's either, now it's like we want Islam. Now, it might not be clear in the minds of the Muslims what that Islam is, what the Khilafah is. But the important thing is they don't hold the Western model in awe anymore. They don't hold democracy in awe anymore. And they don't hold liberal secular values in awe anymore. They have lost the battle. And that's why they are now trying to bomb it into the Muslim world. And they bombed it into Afghanistan for 20 years and they still failed. They tried to do it in Iraq and they still failed. And they're trying it in the West to take Muslims away from Islam by these prevent and CVE policies, combating violent extremism, and they failed. So it shows that Muslims are now gravitating toward Islam, and it's becoming crystallized what it is, what Islam is as a civilization in the minds of many Muslims. But we should remember that political revival will only, we will see the fruits of this when a society decides to abandon the path they are on now and embrace the path that the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum tread by establishing the Islamic civilization in Medina. And we see people using these slogans, Riyasat-e Medina and stuff, because that is what resonates with the people. When politicians use words like Riyasat-e Medina or Islamic society, is because in the masses, the politicians and the leaders know that this is what resonates with the people today. No longer we can call for democracy, no longer we can call for this, because it's not going to resonate with the people anymore. So that is a good sign, but it's just a matter of time that those people who have the ability and the capability to change the destiny of our country and change the qibla of our country and change it back to Islam, when they come to the fore, the change will happen, and it will be a rapid change, and then we will begin to see the revival of the Muslim society, and we will throw a rope to all the people of all the world as a salvation and a protection, and to save them from the darkness and the dhulm spread by human ideologies that have caused all sorts of chaos. Let me just give you one example, which I gave today also in one of the talks. The chaos they have created is now, here in Britain, even those people that hate Islam, even from amongst that quarter, some voices are now saying that on certain issues, the Muslims have been right all along. So for example, just last week in Scotland, there was a man who was convicted of rape, and he was going to court. Before he went to court, he decided to transition into a woman, so he became a woman. So when he came to court as a woman. He was convicted as a rapist, but because he's a woman now, they had to send him to a woman's prison. And you don't have to be a genius to guess what would happen when a trans person goes to a woman's prison. He went to the prison and he raped women in the prison. So now there was a debate. What do we do now? Where do we put this trans woman? And they had to put the trans woman into a man's prison. Into a men's prison, which now undermines their whole philosophy of saying that man has sovereignty over his body. And if a man who is born as a male wants to be a woman, he has every right to do so because he has sovereignty over his body. Now the government has gone against that. So they have undone the whole ideology. So if he says he's a woman, why is he not still in a woman's prison? You mean you know that he's not a woman? So this is the darkness that these people are facing. And some people have now come up in Britain and said, all these Muslims debating, standing up against LGBTQ values, they have been right all along. And there was a petition going around in Britain a couple of weeks ago saying that we don't want the government to teach our children about LGBTQ plus values. Over 200,000 people signed this petition. And that was not just Muslims, that was across the board. And the reason they had the courage to do that is because Muslims, and only the Muslims, stood up. And not the prominent Muslims, children and parents, the common Muslims stood up. And because of their honesty and sincerity and courage, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought barakah out of their effect, of their work, to make everybody take notice that we draw a line, we don't accept this, even if other more capable people decide to remain silent.
Well, exactly. In fact, Mazhar, I've just got a question that's come up here about, in fact, what the listener says, Assalamu alaikum. A massacre is about to befall the Muslims of India. What would the Sultan have done to help the Muslims? Can't the Taliban do it? Jazakallah.
You know, that's a very good point. What can the Muslims do? Again, it's the treachery of our rulers. India is so dependent on the Muslim world, right? If I'm not mistaken, about $1 billion or something like that in revenues goes from the Arab world to Indian economy because of remittances, right? We don't even need to do jihad or anything. All we have to say to India is every Indian is being sent back to India. You look after them. We are going to recruit people from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Somalia, and Yemen to fulfill the job the Indians are doing, right? India would straight away fall into line. When the BJP spokesperson insulted the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there was an uproar in the Middle East, so that one of the Arab governments had to say something. They just opened their mouth, and that was sufficient for the BJP to fire that woman, right? Just because one Arab government said something. Over half of the oil, gas comes from the Muslim world. So much of the resources that India uses comes from the Muslim world. They are dependent. We don't even have to go to stage 2, 3, 4. Stage 1, we can say, we're not selling you oil, we're not selling you gas, and take all your people back. India would not be able to function. Its economy would not be able to function. So we don't even need to go to a military solution to solve this problem. It's not rocket science. But our problem is not India. Our problem is not Modi. Our problem is not Hindutva. Our problem is that we don't have rulers in our country to stand up for Islam. Hindutva only has courage because America is behind India and is strengthening India as a counterweight to China. America doesn't like India. America doesn't believe in Hindutva. They are using India for her geopolitical goals. And the day they don't need India, they will drop India. But the problem here is, because of this support from America, these Hindutva have got this courage. They are not courageous people. They are cowardly people. They are cowardly people, right? And the only reason they are proud is because they know America is behind them. Just like the Zionists. The Zionists are cowardly people, but because America is using them, they suddenly feel very proud, that as if we are strong. You are not strong, but we are being let down, not by the Zionists, not by the Hindutva. We are being let down by the Muslim rulers in Muslim countries who can solve these problems. These are not difficult problems to solve. These are not difficult problems to solve. And the brother asked, why can't Afghanistan do this? Because right now, we find that if you know, was it last week there was a big bomb blast in the police masjid and it was blamed on the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. America is trying to ignite a war between Afghanistan and Pakistan. They're trying to create war between the Muslims in order to deplete them so that India has space to grow and oxygen to breathe. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. You don't have to be a political scientist to work these things out. But this is what's been going on now. And our resources, our politicians are fighting wars which are not our wars, are not our problems. You know, if Afghanistan and Pakistan united, that in itself would send tremors to India. And we could be a
Mazhar, there's just so much more to unpack, but unfortunately, time has run out. But we're certainly looking forward to your Jummah at Miftahul Khair and also the Friday program, the Friday evening program, talking about the Lost Khilafah and its impact, looking at the 100 years, which is the topic. And for those who are in the vicinity, it is taking place on the 10th of February, which is on Friday night, 7:30 p.m. at the Bisbee Adab Hall in Actonville, in Benoni. So if you are around, please make your way to Benoni at the Bisbee Adab Hall in Actonville. But Mazhar, for now, Jazakallah khairan as always, for taking time out and being part of the broadcast, adding value to our broadcast here at Salam Media. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept, Allah reward your efforts, and always an absolute pleasure hosting you.
Ameen and Jazakumullah khairan.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Mazhar Khan, member of Hizb ut-Tahrir in the United Kingdom with us. And with that, we've come to the end of part one of this evening's broadcast. And we're going to proceed to part two. And our focus is going to be on what has been playing out in the United States of America. We are talking about Congresswomen. We're talking about Ilham Omar and the racism towards Muslims in the United States of America. We will be having Dr. Quraisha Suleiman and also Al-Hajj Mauri Salah Khan, who will be part of that panel discussion in a few minutes.